So we're going live. Right. Welcome everybody to our second Fill That Gap Facebook Q&A. This is a three-part series and aims to give you ideas on how to improve feed and nutrient efficiency while increasing on-farm environmental outcomes. If you haven't watched part one of this discussion, I recommend watching the video on the Ballance YouTube channel. My name is Amy Dawson, and I work in the Science Extension team for Ballance AgriNutrients, based out of here in Canterbury, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. So last week in part one, we discussed the scientific research around catch and cover crops, and we heard from Brendan Malcolm from Plant and Food Research, as well as Murray Lane, who is with us today. So we heard about that there's been significant investment in research into catch and cover crops, including the key principles of establishing nutrient recovery and the yield benefits. And in summary, we talked about sowing as early as possible, particularly around nutrient capture, seeding rates in harsher climates, bird predation, and the importance of crop selection. So with the recent announcement on National Freshwater Policy, we also discussed the impact of a recent rule around not having the soil bare for longer than a 1 month post-winter grazing. So it's a video worth catching up on if you've missed it. In today's discussion, Murray Lane and I will look at how we can establish crops from the air using a helicopter, and we'll discuss some farmer case studies, their experiences, and some of the key learnings Murray and the farmers have had along the way. It's important to recognise from recent announcements that resource consents may be required by mid-2021 for farmers who are looking to establish winter crops on greater than a 10-degree slope, which is a lot of the class of country we'll be discussing today, but also if they're looking to establish a crop on greater than 50 hectares of land and or 10% of the farm area. So we'll also be discussing some good management practices to reduce soil and sediment losses from cropped land. So please ask any questions as we go through this discussion, and we'll answer them either as we move through or at the end. Just a note that you will need to have a YouTube account or be logged into your Google account to be able to ask questions. Or if you have a Twitter page, feel free to ask us questions through @BalanceSci. So Murray, let's start with you. For those who haven't watched that first part of the series, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, Amy, and thanks very much. Yeah, I guess I've had a few years working with DuPont and Monsanto over time, R&D work, focusing on crops and Roundup and no tillage. I should put no tillage in there. Leading on to, at the end of that, a little bit of helicropping, moving into rights and seeds, and now I've had quite a few years with Balance, understanding fertility.
Yeah, so you mentioned helicopters. So why are we going to be talking about helicopters today?
Well, it was an interesting moment when a wonderful man called John Reeves from Te Akau, part of the North Island Sheep Council, invited us into a meeting he was having with everybody else in the room and wanted to know how to grow crops on his land, which was hilly and you couldn't get tractors on it. It was, I guess it was, at the time it was Monsanto, Rights and Seeds and Balance who were involved, and there's a few of us who actually thought it wouldn't work. I would be one of them, and it was one of those moments where, you know, we all understand seed to soil contact, we've been told a million times, is important, but the reality is we hadn't done this. And within a year, we'd figured out how to do this. We could grow crops relatively easily wherever we wanted, really.
And we're going to be looking through some of those case studies, I guess, today, those recent examples. So yeah. This is part of a Sustainable Farming Fund project. Do you want to just tell us about, I guess, how this project started and what it hopes to achieve?
Yes, so we know how to helicrop, and the goal now is to understand how do we keep the soil on the land when we put crops wherever we want to put them, and how to have retention of that soil and how to do less damage, for example. How to put in place mitigations around that so that we don't lose the soil off the land. And so this project, we sought funding, and there are a number of, the government Sustainable Farming Fund put some money forward and to match what Balance, Beef and Lamb, Rights and Seeds, New Farm and Agricom had put together via Bay of Plenty Regional Council as well. So it was a very good moment, and so we're 2 years into a process where we're looking at how do we establish cover crops after growing the crop, or how do we keep the soil on the land.
Fantastic. And you've had lots of different farmers involved in those projects who have trialled establishing the crops from the year. So what have been their experiences?
Yeah, there's been a lot of farmers involved. And let's start off. I've got a number of slides here, Amy. I'll start talking about one of them being Colin Armour in the Central North Island. Colin approached, I guess I got involved with Colin many years ago, but maybe 6 or 7 years ago, he had me in the paddock and he was complaining about how he could grow crops on about 60%, 70% of a paddock because it looked like what you can see there. And the question was, how do we actually grow crops on 100% of the paddock? So I gave him a 6-page report that had come out of some work that we'd done earlier in the early 2000s. And 2 years later, he invited me back and this is what he showed me. And I'm thinking 2 things out of this. One is the technology is transferable by a piece of paper. And 2, you can do it by scale. And obviously there's a lot more to it than that. There's the merchants involved, there's a helicopter involved, etc. And I have an understanding of it. But it was quite remarkable that Colin achieved that with a kale crop. It's about 30 hectares, and this is his sweet crop in the same time frame, about 20 hectares. And then even on relatively even land, you can grow a great sweet crop. This is in a later year. So Colin has been tremendous for us because he's given a scale, and on top of that, he's offered. Well, basically, we can spend some time playing around with how do we keep the soil on his land. That's not to say he's not doing his bit, because he goes around each of these paddocks with a big digger every season and puts bunding in. It's just one of the things he does.
So this is maybe looking at winter crops. So you've also been looking at some summer crops as well?
Yeah. So moving on to Jeff Fitzgerald. So Jeff and Joanna near Otrahonga, they grow summer crops, and in this case it's rape. So this is what a paddock looked like in November of the seeds on, the Roundup's on, the slug bait's on, the fertilizer's on, and it's gone brown. And then you come back in early January, and this is what it looks like. It's just, again, quite remarkable. So you've got this, you can see the rape is a darker green, the lighter green is pasture. He had mixed the two, and then he's got a little bit of plantain under it. I mean, Jeff, from my point of view, pioneered mixing plantain with each of these as a companion crop to come on as the season progresses. You can see the plantain growing through there. It gets a lease of life every time it gets the grazing of the rape, and becomes thicker. And then as the season progresses, you get into April, he broadcasts ryegrass in amongst the rape after grazing, and you get to the middle of winter, and Jeff's now got a fully fledged pasture back in place.
So essentially, within 1 year, he's gone through a crop and into a really high productive pasture.
Over one summer season. So you've taken out the brown top and fog pastures, gone through a crop, added a lot of value, finishing lambs, and then finishing off in the wintertime with a new perennial pasture.
And so you've also looked at some other farmers who've been doing some companion planting as well. What has been their experience?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So this is Matt O'Neill over near Rotorua. So Matt's been maybe doing 40 or 50 hectares of helicopter cropping annually. And essentially you're looking for a swede crop for the winter grazing, but he I guess I was introduced to Matt as a guy who is putting companion crop of plantain in with his swedes. So you can see what a swede crop looks like, and then you look down on it, you can see the plantain coming through, and then you look after grazing and you get to see this, and you're there thinking, well, this is an opportunity for us to do things differently. Farmers lead the way on all of these things, and we follow up and try and tidy up the loose ends and make it more reliable. But so you look at the plantain that's growing through there, and then you look a little bit more closely, and there's areas where there's no plantain. Simply that's the grazing effect, where he hadn't moved the stock soon enough, or farm workers hadn't moved the stock soon enough. So essentially out of that came a whole discussion which we put across in the last discussion last week around, well, maybe block grazing is part of this. We move in with block grazing off of the cattle, 3 days or 4 days grazing, and move them at 3. If there's inclement weather coming in, we move them at 3 deliberately and come back later on and take their last day's grazing.
So really trying to protect that cover crop so it stays there for a long time.
Yeah, the plantain gets chewed out completely. It doesn't exist after grazing, but then if you pug the ground like that, then the plant dies as well. In this case, there's a massive seedling regeneration from the seeds that set over the summer underneath the swedes. Now, this is on free draining soil, and Collins is on free draining soil, and Jeff's is on free draining soil. The big challenge for all of this is going to be what can we do at Gore on the heavier soils. And so we've done a little bit of work down there, and we're looking forward to seeing how we can challenge that.
And what about establishing legumes? I know you've got a good example here where we've gone to some legume pastures as well.
Yeah, well, let's move to the southern North Island now, and a wonderful man with a great personality, Mark Grace. So Mark Grace near Hunterville, he's been growing let's just say rape crops for lamb finishing for some years now, again, maybe 50 or 60 hectares per annum, as you can see in this photograph, and he finishes his lambs, and after the grazing, well, even on flat land, this is Mark, by the way, and after the grazing, he establishes another crop, which after the grazing of the rape, and that's either clover in this case, you can see the effects he has, early spring, or clover and plantain. And again, you can see all of that land behind this photograph was once in rape, old pasture into rape, and now into clover and plantain. And you can see that he basically changed his farming system from a lamb breeder to a lamb finisher. Quite an important step for Mark, and at the same time developed his farm.
Wow. And those sorts of pastures must have a big impact on his farm system. And you mentioned that he's now finishing lambs as well. So pretty impressive change.
Yes, yeah. The technology can be used in many places. This is post-forestry block. And so essentially if the trees are harvested and they plant, and the rape, not the rape in this case, it was kale went in, and again it brought lots of value, but it's about putting it back into grass at the appropriate time. So as you can see here,
we can establish a crop anywhere, but I guess we've got to be a bit responsible around that.
Absolutely, and that's the key message we're really trying to bring out, and what this whole project with Sustainable Farming Fund is about. Because we can establish small seeded crops almost anywhere at all, we need to take responsibility for the season of that growth, the type of animal that's going to graze it, the type of crop that's there. For example, Swedes is different to, in this case, rape, because there'll be more disturbance of the soil with Swedes. And again, this is another summer crop of Jeff Fitzgerald's.
Fantastic. So, a lot of people will be thinking, using a helicopter for this purpose must be pretty expensive. So have you done any economics around it, or can give us some idea of costs?
Yeah, I ask that question a lot. So keep it at a high level. And the high level is that to grow a great turnip crop or a great swede crop, it's about $1,500 is what you'd spend per hectare, covering all the bases, doing the side dress and coming up with a great crop, 12 tonne, 15 tonne of Swedes. That's cultivation. Now, if you were to do that in no tillage, you might take $200 or $300, maybe $400 a hectare off that. But when you come back to helicopter cropping will be about the same cost as the cultivated cost. So around about $1,500 a hectare. Now, that's just for establishing the crop and taking it through. And there's another cost comes after that, regrassing, going back into new perennial pasture. So that'll have to.
So that $1,500 you mentioned, what does that actually include in terms of cost?
Yeah, we'll cover this at greater length in 2 weeks' time. But essentially, it's about putting a Roundup spray out there with an insecticide to control the weeds and springtails, etc. And then the slug bait, the seed, and then the fertilizer, a capital dressing of fertilizer.
Yeah.
And I mean, the wonderful thing about it is that, for example, at Jeff Fitzgerald's, we've got a good take on it, and he does his 40 hectare cropping in about 6 hours with a helicopter from where to go. And
so that brings some ideas around if farmers get together and want to do a large proportion of area in a catchment, then that might bring down the cost a little bit as well, getting the helicopter into one place.
Yeah, I guess that'll be up to farmers to coordinate themselves with the pilot. There's some good pilots out there, and there's a lot of good pilots, and well worthwhile taking that step.
Nice. So with recent announcements on the National Freshwater Policy, we mentioned in the introduction, what are some of the good management practices that farmers could consider when they are looking at establishing crop on some of the sloped country?
Well, as we discussed last week, putting a companion crop in there with plantain is a good starting point. But outside of that, so that at the end you've got something afterwards to cover the ground. So outside of that, you've got bunding. You can wander around the site and make sure that the water that's going to flow off the land. For example, in the photograph we're last looking at, making sure that is that is going to be captured, and any soil that moves with it. Actually, before we get on to that, let's just understand that with helicopter cropping, we haven't damaged the soil structure. The soil structure is still intact. And then to grow the crop, and then depending on your animal management, the soil structure should still be intact. We've done work where we've looked at soil loss, compared to cultivation versus helicopter cropping, and in the end, we almost lose nothing at all with helicopter cropping, helicropping, compared to full cultivation. So, buffer strips is one of the things we've talked about, and we're evaluating that at the moment. You take that hillside, Amy, if you put that slide back up. Mm-hmm. It might be that through the middle of that we had deliberately left, particularly if it's a bigger hillside, deliberately left a 3 to 4 metre wide strip of grass, simply because we want any overland runoff to flow through that grass, dropping sediment.
And I guess a helicopter, with its precision, allows you to be able to do that quite easily, particularly on some steeper country.
Yes, we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks' time as well, but a key part of that precision are the AccuFlow nozzles that a lot of pilots have now adopted. They're low drift nozzles. Very, very an important part of the technology. We've talked about the companion cropping. Then there's the cover crop. So after you've grazed these things, particularly in the autumn time, after a summer crop, you're going to go back into perennial pasture or maybe a winter grass. But if you've grazed a winter crop, you really will need to be putting a cover crop of some kind in there. Now, what does that look like? We talked about it again last week, and is it annual ryegrass? Is it a cereal crop? Or is it your new perennial, depending on what's coming afterwards? There's another factor that I'd like to bring up, Amy, and that is I mentioned earlier with Matt O'Neill about the strip versus block grazing. So Matt had moved away from strip grazing to block grazing, one, because it was easy to do, but the outcome of that was the animals can go into an area and consume the feed at leisure rather than under pressure. The strip grazing is all about optimizing the crop yield. So you've yielded your 12 or 13 ton crop. How do you get every piece of blade of leaf out of it? The block grazing, I see it as being all about optimizing or minimizing soil damage. So optimizing the results of the soil.
And particularly, I guess, where you are looking at co-establishment, you are protecting that next crop as well, that one that's coming through.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we've said it already, and it's about matching the land, the slope of that land, to the type of crop, to the season, to the animal class. Really important to be doing.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll talk about it in a couple of weeks' time on the 24th of June, where we have our last session. I'm really going into step by step on how to helicrop. And I guess your first step is identifying the area and the crop that's appropriate as well. So we'll go into more detail then.
Yeah, and it might be, going back to what I said about Colin, it might be that there are areas of the paddock that you actually don't want to crop. Mark Grace has made that decision based on, he's got some very steep faces, which he instructed the pilot not to spray those areas out.
Definitely. So we had a couple of questions come through, or some discussion that I was part of on Twitter last night. And there was a question around, what about using plantain with fodder beet? Any comments around that if we were to look at co-establishment?
So as a companion crop, one of the nice things about plantain is a companion crop with Swedes and with kale, or sorry, not with kale, but with rape, because rape's so much lower growing and multi-graze, but is that the herbicide used with the rape or the Swede is able to be used over top of plantain. So using a plantain companion crop with fodder beet isn't necessarily going to work. I think there's a herbicide challenge there, which would take out the plantain. But there may be other crops that could fit into that bill, because you go into a fodder beet paddock and there's almost nothing else there but fodder beet. And maybe we can fill in some of those gaps with something that's more appropriate.
Because I think you had looked into doing oats, hadn't you, when you looked at a bit of companion cropping, but it didn't do too well up in your area.
Yeah, we played around with some oats, and this was looking at a situation where you put it in and you wait and see what happens. But with kale, for example, the crop goes way too deep, and you've got shading effects and you lose everything there. Plantain was a survivor, but it wasn't a very good survivor underneath the kale crop.
Yeah. Interesting. And another comment that also came up on Twitter last night was whether you could fly on or broadcast on seed with the nitrogen side dressing. So if you had a poor establishment, you could put it on with a nitrogen side dressing just to try and fill in gaps, but also provide that cover once you've finished grazing as well. Any comments on that?
It's a difficult one for us to make a recommendation to mix seed and fertilizer, simply because you don't know where that mix is going to end up. It might be sitting together for some time, in which case the seed could be damaged. So my preference would be that the side dress of nitrogen would go on as required, as you've decided, and you put the seed on targeted to the areas that it didn't establish. It might be that leading on from that question is that, if, for example, you've grown your crop and you're now going into perennial pasture and you're not happy with the establishment that occurred, letting that perennial pasture seed in its first season is going to put a lot more seed on the ground and give you a much denser pasture.
So with the recent announcement around having to go back into a crop 1 month post-winter grazing, there's probably a real opportunity for helicopters even on flat country, especially in some of those heavier soils that you mentioned down in Gore and Southland. Yeah,
I think it's a very, very good option for us all. Helicopters, in fact, the future might be that the farmer will have 10 drones lined up on his table, and he'll push a button and they'll take off with a couple of kilograms of seed and put it on where the cattle have just grazed. So potentially that's where it's going to go. But with the new regulations around having to have seed on the ground within a month from next winter, within a month of grazing, we're all going to be challenged. How do we do this? And we're not going to be able to get onto all of the land. So there's a number of things we've talked about here, using a helicopter to broadcast that seed. And we're playing around with bird repellents as part of that. There's a thing called Avipel, and we'll find out how successful we're going to be with that this coming winter. And then I guess it's about managing the soil so it doesn't become a pug mess. So part of the challenge is, are you creating a seed bed or a soup? We actually want a seed bed in the middle of winter, so maybe the block grazing fits in amongst that. Yeah, some ideas for us to pursue.
Yeah, definitely. No, some great discussion there, and I think we'll end it there today, because I think we've covered some really good points around how successful we can be at establishing both winter and summer crops, and how we can look to actually do that by also protecting the soil too. So some good comments there. So thank you everybody for joining us today for part 2 of our 3-part series. And as we mentioned on the way through, we do have our last one on the 24th of June, and that's really where we're going to step through detailed how to actually helicrop and do it successful. And we mentioned already around your choice of site and crop is really important for that too. So this series is part of a wider Sustainable Farming Fund project, looking at helicropping, farm system fit, and developing tools and advice around helicropping. So we'd like to thank our sponsors, which you can see along the bottom there. So particularly Beef and Lamb, Ballance AgriNutrients, PGG Rights and Seeds, New Farm, and the Bay of Plenty Regional Council. If you do want any more information on helicropping or this project, feel free to go to www.balance.co.nz/helicropping, and the project gets updated through that website. So we hope to see you all on the 24th of June, where we'll discuss step by step on how to helicrop. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.